Today, I'm going to show you how I built this record player table. I incorporated design elements from classic furniture and old guitar amps. But originally, the concept for this video was that I was going to build a table using only scraps from old projects. But it's a great example of how much a project can take on a life of its own and evolve during the build process. And by the end, there were some little details I was able to include that you're not going to want to miss. Let's dive in. Normally I start projects off by modeling them in Fusion 360, but since I had planned on using primarily scraps and cutoffs, I wanted to keep an eye on my lumber stock for ideas, so I sketched first in my handy dandy notebook. I knew the general width and height I wanted for the table, and that it needed to be able to store my collection of EPs and LPs while also leaving space for the record player and the standard coffee table stuff. I had some pre-cut plywood from a previous cabinet project that was already ripped to 16 inches wide. That would be plenty of space for the EPs and LPs, but it only took a quick calculation to realize I didn't have enough. So the first change was to scale down the size by just a bit. I cut the plywood and assembled the outside of the box with countersunk screws. My intention at this point was just to keep it simple and fill those later with walnut dowels. For the spreaders, I opted for pocket holes that would be hidden eventually by the top. I was feeling pretty good about how fast this was moving already, so when I finished drilling the holes, I attached the spreaders, finishing out the shell. But, as is often the case during my I'm making this up as I go projects, I completely forgot that I needed to put a channel in the plywood for what would soon become the back of the box. So, I disassembled it and moved over to the table saw to remedy that. But as a result of this mistake, backing those screws out caused the top layer of plywood to rip off around several of the screws. So I also had to start thinking about how we're going to make that not look terrible. But I had some ideas. I ran the 4 pieces across the table saw 3 times each, adjusting slightly until I had just enough space for the 1/4 inch plywood to fit snug, but not so snug it would be difficult to assemble. With those grooves cut, I reassembled the main box and started looking through my 1/4 inch plywood scraps. I found a scrap that was big enough to cover the whole back, but more interestingly, I found this piece that wouldn't, and it gave me the idea to add a cubby above the main storage area that could be used for electronics or other stuff, but more importantly, would liven up this boring old box. So I cut that to length and dropped it into the groove, then cut another shelf and placed it into the center, propped up by a scrap piece of plywood. Since removing those screws earlier had mangled the sides, I didn't care so much about marring it up any further, so I whipped out the 15 gauge nailer and attached the center shelf all around. Then I used glue to attach the center support. That shot me right in the neck with that air. That scared the shit out of me. I got a little worried about those nails lasting long term, so for good measure and rigidity, I added a couple screws to each side also. I took some measurements for the face frame and went back to the lumber pile. I had a stick of black Limba left over from the guitar, desk, and table I'd built last year, so I ripped it down to 2.5 inch strips. There wouldn't be enough to make the sliding doors, but there might be enough to frame out some traditional flush mount doors. I used the miter saw to cut the outer perimeter of the face frame, then laid them out on the table to try and find the most attractive layout of the grain and colors against each other before drilling some more pocket holes. Since I was bumping up from the usual 3/4 inch stock to 1 inch, I took a moment here to adjust the Craig jig before drilling the holes around the face frame. Then I attached the outer 4 pieces with the pocket screws, but I left the center dividers out so I could line them up and ensure there was a slight lip for an idea I'd had in the meantime. So with the face frame propped in place, I marked the exact location on each side with a pencil, then installed the center and cabinet door divider. I used a pin nailer to attach the face all around, but if I were doing this again, knowing some of the changes I would be making in the next couple days, I would have used pocket holes here instead. And save for a little accident that I'll get to here in a sec, the pin nails did work fine and aren't noticeable in the finished product. Pocket holes can pull forward sometimes, and a couple of them did here. This left a taller surface on one side on some of the joints. I used a hand plane to quickly even those surfaces on the ones where it was really noticeable or that I didn't think the sander would be able to knock down. Then, I sanded from 80 to 120 to 220 grit with the orbital sander. Next, I started cutting out the doors. I was preoccupied here with the fact that I was running low on black Limba, and the whole focus of this video was supposed to be using scraps. And of course, I ran out of black Limba on the last cut. But that's not all. So I flubbed a little bit on these, and I wasn't thinking about running them through the shaper. I don't know why I wasn't thinking about that. I guess because I've only done a handful of doors on the shaker in the first place, or on the shaper. But as a result, I didn't cut these center pieces long enough. They need to have extra since they'd get trimmed off, and part of it will be inside the rails. So that was a big flub on my part, especially considering I was already running out and had to do a glue up to get enough lumber to finish even the second door. That flub, as I so eloquently called it, can mean only one thing: more pocket holes. Except, as it turns out, I didn't cut them too short. I cut them too long, and then drilled pocket holes, and then didn't realize I could have put them in the shaper and instead cut it down and drilled more pocket holes. But mistakes happen. It's just in how we deal with them. So I just rolled with it. I already needed to do something with the outside plywood faces, and I'd fixed the doors by cutting off the excess and just drilling more pocket holes. And since I'd used all the black Limba already, I considered those pocket hole plugs to be cool scars with a story. But the process of staring at those door frames got me thinking, what if I put a grill in these doors? What if I could somehow make this thing look like an old amp, and that record player built-in we had when I was a kid had a rad-looking baby? While I was pondering what that was going to look like, I cut some walnut to length for the top of the table, and then ran it over the joiner a few times to get a good clean edge. I applied some glue and tossed it in the clamps to set up overnight. Then I headed inside for a bourbon. I had some things I needed to order from Amazon. But because there had just been a winter storm in my area, none of what I needed was going to make it anytime soon. So I made a list and went to my local craft store the next morning. Okay, this glue up sat overnight. It looks like it's going to be pretty cool. I'm going to have to obviously sand it down and stuff. So let's get this table cleaned up so I can start working on the legs, and then we're going to do something really cool. While I cleaned up the table, which is boring, the laser was doing this, which is super cool. I sketched up an expanded metal pattern for the grill and had the laser cutting it out of walnut veneered plywood. Since the top was walnut and these grills were walnut, I chose walnut for the legs as well to tie it all together. I purposely made this top much larger than it needed to be, so that it would be easier to square up, but also so I could use the cutoffs to fashion the legs. I ran it over the table saw once on the near side to create a straight edge. Then I used that straight edge against the fence to cut a parallel one on the opposite side, the desired depth of the tabletop. I haven't built a sled for my table saw yet, and the top was too wide for the miter saw. So I used a square to mark the other two edges, then clamped a metal yardstick to the piece at the correct distance from the guide on my circular saw to make clean and even cuts. I sent the top and the doors through the drum sander a few times to get them rough sanded down to 80 grit. Then I moved over to the orbital sander to get them all the way down to 220. I marked the surface with a pencil between each grit to make sure I was getting an even and consistent surface. Then I used a handheld router to add a 45-degree chamfer to the top edge all around and sanded that down for good measure. With all the main cabinet pieces now completed, I set up the paint booth, and using General Finishes high performance gloss, I applied 6 coats, sanding with a 400 grit sanding sponge in between. I had glued up the cutoffs to make the legs, so I pulled those out and ran them across the joiner to make sure they were good and square on all sides. I cut the legs to length, 10 inches each, and cut a slight taper on the table saw. This part I'd never done before, and it's definitely something I want to practice and get better at. I got a little gun shy with how close this apparatus was to the blade, and stopped after that first taper. But I think building a good sled and getting more comfortable with the process will be fun and lend itself to more complex designs later. I ran the newly tapered legs over the router with a 1/2 inch roundover bit, then sanded them down with the orbital sander. Then I drilled some holes in the tops using the drill press and installed some threaded inserts to make the legs removable. This is the point where I deviated from the scraps only concept. I had gone to the local craft store earlier and picked up some faux leather, and had ordered a couple different colors of speaker grill fabric online. It was time to see if what I envisioned in my head could become a reality. Like anything I've never done before, this part was a little clumsy and frustrating at first, but I started to get the hang of it. I cut the material to length to wrap 3 sides of the box and used spray adhesive, starting at one end and working to the other a little at a time. I used thumbtacks to hold up that top left side while I got the rest laid out and cut where necessary. Once I started with the adhesive, I had to work fairly quickly to get to the other side to limit bubbles and make sure that the adhesive would set up. Then I just used a razor blade to trim off the excess. I learned a few lessons on that first install, so when I started the upper cubby, I did 2 things differently. 1, I cut the leather a lot closer to exact dimensions so there would be less to trim and manage. And 2, I rolled up the leather so it was less awkward to manipulate. So, also like things we've never done before, the second time got a little easier and went a lot smoother. I should also mention that I used the bottom ledge of a metal speed square as a squeegee for this application. It helped push the bubbles out without marring up the leather, but also was able to push into corners really nice without having to cut them. The sides were a similar process, except for some reason, it never occurred to me at the time that it would be way easier to just flip this thing over on its top and work around it. Instead, I committed to this stupid roll it over as I go strategy, which ended up almost ruining the project. Oh, I just rubbed that through something nasty. Just, Well, sometimes that's just a day in the shop, you know? Let's see if we can salvage this. I had a few things to repair from the fall, but since it was already on the floor, I went ahead and finished the rest of the leather install. I smoothed out the bubbles as I went, and I stapled the back to keep everything nice and tight. The scuffs you see here are actually just dirt and sawdust. It all wiped right off later, so I immediately started to feel a little bit better. I got it back up on the table and installed the legs. There were a few bubbles that needed to be fixed, but the biggest issue was the one I mentioned earlier. Because I had used pin nails for the front, the fall had shifted the face frame just slightly, but enough that the top wouldn't sit flush without intervention. So, I used a hammer and another piece of wood to beat it back into place. The leather just wasn't laying down at the edges inside the lip I'd made. So to remedy that, I picked up these antique brass upholstery pins, and I immediately fell in love with how they looked. But they also solved the issue perfectly. Almost anywhere the leather wasn't quite tight enough, I could pull on it and insert one of these pins, and it fixed it. I used a lighter to run down the seam to burn off any strings and frays that were sticking up. A simple and easy trick to get a crisp, clean edge. Then I added the brass tacks to both sides as well. I was really happy with how this was starting to look. While I hammered in the tacks, I had the CNC cutting the channel in the back of the door for the grill faces. I didn't want to risk messing these up with a hand router, so I let the machine handle that while I focused on cleaning up the rest. Once it was finished up, I used that same metal speed square as a spacer for the bottom, and the door hinge itself for the left spacer to get the doors squared up. Then, I used painter's tape and a loose hinge to mark exactly where I needed to attach them. I attached the doors, but as you can see here, I still needed to do a little adjustment to be 100% straight. In the meantime though, I had been sending progress pictures to the guys in my band, and one of them suggested I add an amp logo to the speaker grill. What a great idea. So I cut one up on the laser, and instantly loved it. Next, I needed to put the speaker grill cloth on the frames. I focus group tested the two options, and even though I was originally leaning pretty heavily toward the black, this tweed looking material was the clear winner when placed side by side. I cut a rough square of the material out, then used spray adhesive on the back of the grill to attach it, and placed some weights on top to hold it down while it dried. Once it was dry, I trimmed the excess with a razor knife.
I love it. It's turned out really cool. I'm pretty happy with myself.
I was originally going to do 2 of those little amp logos, but after I saw them side by side, I decided to just do one in the bottom right. It just felt more authentic that way. To attach the grills, I used a stapler, angling out so that one side got the grill and the other wedged into the frame. I've seen furniture companies do this, so I assumed it was the right move here.
It looks so good. I'm so happy with this.
These little details made me so happy. To see how they really made the piece come alive was such a fun experience. But I still had one more to go.
Why don't you just make 10 louder and make 10 be the top number and make that a little louder?
These go to 11.
That's right. It goes to 11. I built a little jig to hold cabinet handles upright, so I could use the laser to burn volume knobs on it. And of course, in honor of one of the classic rockinest movies ever made, it had to go to 11. This is hands down one of my favorite things I've ever built. I love every detail about it. And I love that it was an adventure from start to finish, changing course as needed and testing new skills along the way. It certainly isn't perfect, but getting things perfect has to start somewhere. And for me, it's trying and failing and trying again until I get it right. And by the end, I think I got this right. Thanks for watching.